Chapter 20. About the middle of the forenoon of that day, Madeline reached the ranch. Her guests had all arrived there late the night before, and watched only her presence and the assurance of her well-being to consider the loss of the camping trip a rare adventure. Likewise, they voted it the cowboy's masterpiece of a trick. Madeline's delay, they averted, had been an oddly clever coup to give a final effect. She did not correct their impression, nor think it was needful to state that she had been escorted home by only one cowboy. Her guests reported an audacious ride down the mountain, with only one incident that led to excitement. On the descent they had fallen in with Sheriff Haw and several of his deputies, who were considerably under the influence of drink and very greatly enraged by the escape of the Mexican girl Benita. Haw had used insulting language to the ladies, and accordingly to Ambrose had been inconvenienced the party on some pretext or another, if he had not been sharply silenced by the cowboys. Madeline's guests were 2 days in recovering from the hard ride. On the third day they leisurely began to prepare for the departure. This period had doubly been trying for Madeline. She had her own physical need of rest, and moreover had to face a mental conflict that could scarcely be postponed further. Her sisters and friends were kindly and earnestly persistent in their entreaties for her to go back east with them. She desired to go. It was not that mattered. It was how, and when, and under what circumstances she was to return that aroused her disturbing emotion. Before she went east, she wanted to have fixed in her mind her future relation to the ranch and the West. When the crucial hour arrived, she found that the West had not claimed her yet. These old friends had warmed cold ties. It turned out, however, that there need be no hurry about making the decision. Madeline would have welcomed any excuse to procrastinate, but as it happened, a letter from Alfred made her departure out of the question for the present. He wrote her that his trip to California had been profitable, that he had a proposition for Madeline from a large cattle company, and particularly that he wanted to marry Florence soon after his arrival home and bring a minister from Douglas for that purpose. Madeline went so far, however, as to promise Helen and her friends that she would go east soon, at the very latest by Thanksgiving. With that promise, they were reluctantly content to say goodbye to the ranch and to her. At the last moment, there seemed a great likelihood of a hitch in plans for the first stage of that homeward journey. All of Madeline's guests held up their hands Western fashion when Link Stevens appeared with the big white car. Link protested innocently, solemnly, that he would drive slowly and safely, but it was necessary for Madeline to guarantee Link's word and to accompany them when they entered the car. At the station, goodbyes they were spoken and repeated, and Madeline's promise was exacted for the 100th time. Dorothy Combs' last words were, "Give my love to Monty Priss. Tell him I'm glad he kissed me." Helen's eyes had a sweet, grave, yet mocking light as she said, "Majesty, bring Stuart with you when you come. He'll be the rage." Madeline treated the remark with the same merry lightness which had received from by the others, but after the train had pulled out, and she was on her way home, she remembered Helen's words and looked with something almost amounting to a shock. Any mention of Stuart, any thought of him, displeased her. What did Helen mean? Mused Madeline, and she pondered. That mocking light in Helen's eyes had been simply an ironically glint, a cynical gleam from that worldly experience so suspicious and tolerant in its wisdom. The sweet gravity of Helen's look had been a deeper and more subtle thing. Madeline wanted to understand it, to divine in a new relation between Helen and herself something fine and sisterly that might lead to love. The thought, however, revolting around sort of a strange suggestion of Stuart, was poisoned at its inception, and she had dismissed it. Upon the drive into the ranch, as she was passing the lower lake, she saw Stuart walking listlessly along the shore. When he became aware of the approach of the car, he suddenly awoken from his aimless sauntering and disappeared quickly into the shade of the shrubbery. This was not by any means the first time Madeline had seen him avoid a possible meeting with her. Somehow the act pained her. Though affording her relief, she did not wish to meet him face to face. It was annoying for her to guess that Stillwell had something to say in Stuart's defense. The old cattleman was evidently distressed. Several times he had tried to open a conversation with Madeline regarding Stuart, and she had evaded him until the last time, when his persistence had brought a cold and final refusal to hear another word about the foreman. Stillwell was crushed. As days passed, Stuart remained at the ranch without his old faithfulness to his work. Madeline was not moved to a kinder frame of mind to see him wandering dejectedly about. It hurt her, and because it hurt her, she grew all the more harder. Then she could not help hearing snatches of conversation which strengthened her suspicion that Stuart was losing its grip on himself, that he would soon take the downward course again. Verification of her own suspicion made it a belief, and belief brought about a sharp confliction between her generosity and some feeling that she could not name. It was not a question of justice or mercy or sympathy. It was a single word that could have saved Stuart from sinking his splendid manhood into the brute she had recoiled from at Tricrilla, and she would not have spoken it. She could not restore him to his former place in her regard. She really did not want him at the ranch at all. Once, considering in wonder her knowledge of the man, she interrogated herself to see why she could not overlook Stuart's transgression. She never wanted to speak to him again, or see him, or think about him. In some way, through her interest in Stuart, she had come to feel of herself an inexplicable thing towards close to scorn. A telegram from Douglas, heralding the coming of Alfred and a minister, put an end to Madeline's brooding, and she shared something of Florence Kingsley's excitement. The cowboys were as eager and gossipy as girls. It was arranged to have the wedding ceremony performed in Madeline's great hall chamber, and the dinner in the cool, flower-scented patio. Alfred and his minister arrived at the ranch in the big white car. They appeared considerably wind-blown. In fact, the minister was breathless, almost sightless, and certainly hatless. Alfred, all used to as he was of wind and speed, remarked that he did not wonder at Nell's aversion to riding a fleet and cannonball. The imperturbable Link took off his cap and goggles, and consulted his watch, and made his usual apologetic report to Madeline, deploring the fact that a teamster and a few stray cattle on the road had held him down to only a mile a minute. Arrangements for the wedding brought Alfred's delighted approval. When he had learned all of Florence's and Madeline would tell him, he expressed a desire to have the cowboys attend, and then he went on to talk about California and where he was going to be taking Florence on a short trip. He was curiously interested to find out all about Madeline's guests and what had happened to them. His keen glance at Madeline grew softer as she talked. "I'll breathe again," he said, and laughed. "I was afraid. Well, I might have missed some sport. I can just fancy what Monty and Nels did to that Irishman. So you went up to the crags, eh? That's a wild place. I'm not surprised that Gruel is fallen in up there with you. The crags are a famous rendezvous for Apaches. It's near the border, almost inaccessible, has good water and grass. I wonder what the U.S. Cavalry would think if they knew those guerrillas crossed the border right under their noses. Well, it's practically impossible to patrol some of that borderline. It's desert and mountain and canyon. Terribly wild and broken. I'm sorry to say there seems to be more trouble in sight, though, with these guerrillas than at any time here, too. That Ortoko, the rebel leader has failed to withstand the Madero's army. The Federals, they're occupying Tricurla now, and they're driving the rebels north. The Orcarellas has broken up his army into guerrilla bands, and they're moving north and west, intending to carry on guerrilla warfare into Sonora. I can't say just how this will affect us up here, though. But we're too close to the border for comfort anyway. Those guerrillas, they're night-riding hawks, and they can cross the border, raid us here, and get back in the same night. Fighting, I imagine, will not be restricted to the northern Mexico. With the revolution a failure, the guerrillas will have more numerous and bolder and hungrier. Unfortunately, we happen to be in a favorable situation for them down here in this wilderness corner of the state. On the following day, Alfred and Florence were married. Florence's sister and several friends from El Cajon were present besides Madeline, Stillwell, and his men. It was Alfred's express wish that Stuart attended the ceremony. Madeline was amused when she noticed the painful, suppressed excitement of the cowboys. For them, a wedding must have been an unusual, impressive event. She began to have a better understanding of the nature of it when they cast off restraint and pressed forward to kiss the bride. In all her life, Madeline had never seen a bride kiss so much and so heartily, nor one so flushed and dishevelled and happy. This, indeed, was a joyful occasion. There was nothing of the fussy East about Alfred Hammond. He might have been a Western all of his days. When Madeline managed to get through the press of the cowboys and offer her congratulations, Alfred gave her a great big old bear hug and a kiss. This appeared to fascinate the cowboys. With shining faces and eyes that aglow with smiling and boyish boldness, they made a rush at Madeline. For one instant her heart leaped to her throat. They looked as if they could almost shamelessly kiss and maul her. That little, ugly-faced, soft-eyed, rude, tender-hearted ruffian, Monty Price, was in the lead. He resembled a dragon acuted with sentiment. All at once, Madeline's instinctive antagonist had been touched by strange hands, her lips battered with a real, warm, and fun-loving desire to let the cowboys have their will upon her. But she saw Stuart hanging at the back of the crowd, and some fierce, dark expression of pain amazed her, while it froze her desire to be kind. Then she did not know what change must have come to her face and bearing, but she saw Monty fall back sheepishly, and the other cowboys draw aside to let her lead the way into the patio. The dinner began quietly enough, with the cowboys divided between embarrassment and appetites that they evidently feared to indulge. Wine, however, loosened their tongues, and when Stillwell got up to make a speech every one seemed to expect of him, they greeted him with a roar. Stillwell was now one huge mountainous smile. He was so happy that he appeared to be on the verge of tears. He rambled on ecstatically till he came to raise his glass. "And now, girls and boys, let's all drink to the bride and groom, to their sincere and lasting love, to their happiness and prosperity, to their good health and good long life. Let's drink to the uniting of the East with the West. No man full of red blood and real breath of life could resist a Western girl, and a good horse and God's free hand that open land out here. So we claim Al Hammond, and may we be true to him, and friends, I think it fitting that we drink to his sister and to our hopes. Here's to the lady we hope to make our majesty. Here's to the man who's come to ride out to the West, a fine, big-hearted man, with a fast horse and a strong rope, and may he win and hold her. Come on, friends, drink." A heavy pound of horses' hoofs and a yell outside arrested Stillwell's voice and halted his hand mid-air. The patio became as silent as an unoccupied room. Through the open doors and windows of Madeline's chambers burst the sound of horses stamping to a halt, and then a harsh speech of men and a low cry of a woman in pain. Rapid steps crossed the porch and entered Madeline's room. Nels appeared in the doorway. Madeline was surprised to see that he had not been at the dinner table, and she was disturbed by the sight upon his face. "Stuart, you're wanted outdoors," called Nels bluntly. "Monty, you come on out here with me. You, Nick, Stillwell, I reckon the rest of you better shut the doors and stay inside." Nels disappeared. Quick as a cat, Monty glid out. Madeline heard his soft, swift steps past her window into her office. He had left his guns there. Madeline trembled. She saw Stuart get up quietly, and without any change of expression on his dark, sad face, leave the patio. Nick Steele followed him. Stillwell dropped his wine-glass. As it broke, shivering the silence, his huge smile vanished. His face set into the old crackiness, and the red slowly thickened into black. Stillwell went out and closed the door behind him. Then there was blank silence. The enjoyment of the moment had been rudely disturbed. Madeline glanced down the line of brown faces to see the pleasure fade into the old familiar hardness. "What's wrong?" asked Alfred rather stupidly. The change in mood had been too rapid for him. Suddenly he awoke, thoroughly aroused at the interruption. "I'm going to go see what's butting in on her, spoiling our dinner." Then he strode outside. He returned before anyone at the table had spoken or moved, and now the dull red of anger molted his forehead. "It's that dang sheriff of El Cajon," he exclaimed. "Pat Haw, with some of his tough deputies, come to arrest Gene Stewart. They got that poor little Mexican girl out there tied to a horse. Confound that sheriff!" Madeline calmly rose from the table, eluding Florence's entreating hand, and started for the door. The cowboys jumped up. Alfred barred her progress. "Alfred, I am going out," she said. "No, I guess not. That's no place for you." "I am going." She looked straight at him. "Madeline, why, what is it? You look... Dear, there's pretty sure to be trouble out there. Maybe there'll be a fight. You can do nothing. You can't go out." "Perhaps I can prevent trouble," she replied. As she left the patio, she was aware that Alfred, with Florence at her side and the cowboys behind, had started to follow her. When she got out of her room up on the porch, she heard several men in loud, angry discussion. Then, at the sight of Benita, helplessly and cruelly tied upon a horse, pale, disheveled, and suffering, Madeline experienced the thrill that sight or mention of this girl always gave her. It yielded to a hot pain in her breast, that live pain which so shamed her. But almost instantly, as the second glance showed an agony in Benita's face, her bruised arms where the ropes bit deep into her flesh, her little brown hands stained with blood, Madeline was overcome by pity for the unfortunate girl and a woman's righteous passion at such barbarous treatment of one of her own sex. The man holding the bridle of the horse on which Benita had been bound was at once recognized by Madeline as the big-bodied, bullet-headed gorilla who had found the basket of wine in the spring at camp. Redder of face, blacker of beard, coarser of aspect, evidently under the influence of liquor, he was fierce-looking as a gorilla and repulsive. Beside him, there was 3 other men present, all mounted on weary horses. The one in the foreground, gaunt, sharp-featured, red-eyed, with a pointed beard, she recognized as the sheriff of El Cajon. Madeline hesitated, then stopped in the middle of the porch. Alfred, Florence, and several others followed her out. The rest of the cowboys and guests, they crowded about the windows and doors. Stillwell saw Madeline and threw up his hands and roared to be heard. This quieted the gathering of men. Well now, Pat Haw, what's driving you like a loke steer on a rampage? Demanded Stillwell. Keeping the traces, Bill, replied Haw. You know what I've come for. I've been biding my time, but now I'm ready. I'm here to arrest a criminal. The huge frame of the old cattleman jerked as he had been stabbed. His face turned purple. What criminal? He shouted hoarsely. The sheriff flicked his quirt against his dirty boot and twisted his thin lips in a leer. The situation was agreeable to him. Why, Bill, I knowed you had a good-for-nothing outfit riding this range, but I wasn't wise that you had more'n one criminal. You cut that talk. Which cowboy you want for arresting? Haw's manner altered. Jane Stewart, he replied curtly. On what charge? For killing a greaser one night last fall. So you're still harping on that, Pat? You're on the wrong trail. You can lay that killing on someone other than Stewart. The thing ancient by now. But if you're insisting on bringing him to court, let the rest go today. We're having us a fiesta here, and I'll fetch Gene into El Cajon myself. Nope. I reckon I'll take him when I got the chance before he takes off. I'll giving you my word, thundered Stillwell. I reckon I don't have to take your word, Bill, or anyone else's. Stillwell's great bulk quivered with his rage, yet he made a successful effort to control it. Well, see here, Pat. I know what's reasonable. Law's law, but in this country, there's always been, and this now is, a safe and sane way to proceeding with the law. Maybe you're forgetting that. The law is invested in one man in a wild country is liable, owing to that man's weakness and omitting authority, to be disputed even by an old decent cattleman like myself. I'm going to be giving you a hunch. Pat, you're not overly liked in these parts. You've rid too much with your high hand. Some of your dealings have been pretty shady, and don't you overlook what I'm saying. But you're the sheriff, and I'm respecting your office. I'm respecting it this much. If the milk of human decency is so sour in your breast that you haven't a kind of feeling, then trying to avoid the unpleasantness that results from any contrary move on your part today. Do you get that hunch? Stillwell, you're threatening an officer, replied Haw angrily. You hitting that trail kind of quick, eh? Inquired Stillwell in a strained voice. I guarantee that Stewart's appearance in El Cajon any day you want. No, I've come to arrest him, and I'm going to. So that's your game, shouted Stillwell. We all be glad to straighten you out, Pat. Now listen, you cheap red-eyed coyote of a sheriff. You don't care how many enemies you make. You know you'll never get office again in this county. What do you care now? It is amazingly strange how earnest you are to hunt down a man who killed that particular greaser. I reckon there's been some dozen or more killings of greasers in the last year. Why don't you take to trailing some of them killings? I'll tell you why. You're afraid to go near the border, and your hate of Gene Stewart makes you want to hound him and put him where he doesn't want to belong, in jail. You want to in spite of his friends. Well, listen here, you lean-jawed, skunk-bitten coyote. You go ahead and try and arrest him. Stillwell took one mighty stride off the porch. His last words had been cold. His rage appeared to have transferred to Haw. The sheriff began to sputter and shake a lanky red hand at the cowman when Stewart stepped out. Here, you fellas, give me a chance to say a word. As Stewart appeared, the Mexican girl suddenly seemed to vitalize out of her stupor. She strained at her bonds as if to lift her hands beseechingly. A flush animated her haggard face, and her dark, big eyes lighted. "Senor Jean," she moaned, "help me. I'm sick. They beat me with rope and almost killed me. Help me, Jean."
"Shut up or I'll gag ya,"
said the man who held Benita's horse.
"Muzzle her up, steed, if she blabs again,"
called out Pat Haw. Madeline felt something tense and strained working in the short silence. Was it only a phrase of her thrilled excitement? Her swift glance showed the face of Nels and Monty and Nick to be brooding, cold, and watchful. She wondered why Stuart did not look towards Benita. He, too, was now dark-faced, cool, quiet, with something ominous about him. I'll submit to arrest without any fuss, if you take the ropes off that girl," he said.
"No," replied the sheriff. "She got away from me once, and she's hog-tied now, and she'll stay hog-tied."
Madeline thought she saw Stuart give a slight start, but an unaccountable dimness came over her eyes, a brief intervals that obscured her keen eyesight. Vaguely she was conscious of a clogging and beaten turmoil in her breast. "All right, let's hurry out of here," said Stuart. "You've made an annoyance enough. Ride down to the corral with me. I'll get my horse and go with you."
"Hold on,"
yelled out Haw as Stuart turned away.
"Not so fast. Who's doing this? You don't come no well-kept stunts on me. You'll ride on my pack horse, and you'll do it in irons."
"You want to handcuff me?" inquired Stuart with sudden swiftness of passion.
"Want to? Ha ha! No, Stuart, that's just my way with horse thieves, raiders, and greasers, and murderers, and such. See here, you snide, get off and put them irons on this man."
The guerrilla, named Snide, slid off his horse and began to fumble in his saddlebag.
"You see, Bill,"
went on Haw,
"I swore in a new deputy for this particular job. That there Sneed's pretty handy. He rounded up that little Mexican cat for me."
Stillwell did not hear the sheriff. He was gazing at Stuart in kind of an imploring gaze. "Gene, you aren't going to stand for them handcuffs, is ya?" he pleaded. "Yep," replied the cowboy. "Bill, old friend, I'm an outsider here. There's no call for Miss Hammond and her brother and Florence to get worried further about me. Their happy day has already been spoiled on my account. I just want to get out of here quick for you."
"Well, you don't gotta be so damn considerate of Miss Hammond's sensitive feelings."
There was now no trace of the courteous, kindly old rancher. He looked harder than stone.
"What about my feelings? I want to know if you're going to let that sneaking coyote, this last grasp of an old rum-guzzled frontier sheriff, put you in irons and hog-tie you and drive you out of jail."
"Yep," replied Stuart steadily.
"Well, by God, Eugene Stewart, what's come over you? Why, man, go in that house and I'll tend to this feller, and tomorrow you can ride in and give yourself up like a gentleman."
"No, I'll go, but thanks, Bill, for the way you and the boys they stick up for me. Let's hurry up, Haw, before I change my mind." His voice broke at the last, betraying the wonderfully control he had over his passions. As he ceased speaking, he seemed suddenly to become spiritless, and he dropped his head. Madeline saw in him then an semblance to the hopeless, shamed Stuart of the earlier days. The vague riot in her breast leaped into a curious fury. A woman's passionate repugnance of Stuart's broken spirit. It was not that she would have him to be a law-breaker. It was that she could not bear to see him deny his manhood. Once she had entreated him to become her kind of a cowboy, a man in whom reason tempered passion. She had let him see how painful and shocked any violence had grown upon her, and the idea had obsessed him and softened him, and had grown like a solemnifying leash upon his will, and showed him of a wild, bold spirit she now strangely longed to see him and feel. When the man Sneed came forward, jingling the iron fetters, Madeline's blood turned to fire. She would have forgiven Stuart then for lapsing into the kind of cowboy behavior that she had come to understand. This was a man's West, a man's game. What right had a woman reared in a softer mold to use her beauty and her influence to change a man who was bold and free and strong? At that moment, with her blood hot and racing, she would have gloried in the violence which she had so deplored. She would have welcomed the action that had characteristic Stuart's treatment of Don Carlos. She had in him the sudden dawning temperament of a woman who had assimilated the life and nature round her, and who would not have turned her eyes away from a harsh and bloody deed. But Stuart held forth his hands to be shackled. Then Madeline heard her own voice burst out in a ringing, impervious, "Wait!" In the time it took her to take the few steps to the edge of the porch, facing the man, she not only felt her anger and justice and pride summoning forces to her command, but there was something else calling. A deep, passionate, mysterious thing not born to the moment. Steed dropped the shackles. Stuart's face took on a chalky whiteness. Haw, in a slow, stupid embarrassment beyond his control, removed his sombrero in a respect that seemed to wrench from him. "Mr. Haw, I can prove to you that Stuart was not in any way, shape, or form in part of the crime of which you want to arrest him." The sheriff's stare underwent a blinking change. He had been so thrown completely off balance. Astonishment slowly merged into discomfort. "It was absolutely impossible for Stuart to have been connected with that assault," went on Madeline swiftly, "for he was with me in the waiting room of the station at the moment the assault had been made outside. I assure you I have a distinct and vivid recollection. The door was open. I heard the voices of quarreling men. They grew louder. The language was Spanish. Evidently these men had left the dance hall opposite and were approaching the station. I heard a woman's voice mingled with the others. It too was Spanish, and I could not understand, but the tone was beseeching. Then I heard footsteps upon the gravel. I know Stuart heard them. I could see from his face that something dreadful was about to happen. Just outside the door there were hoarse and furious voices, a scuffle, a muffled shot, a woman's cry, and the thud of a falling body, and rapid footsteps of a man running away. Next, the girl Benita staggered into the door. She was white, trembling, and terror-stricken. She recognized Stuart, appealing to him. Stuart supported her and endeavored to calm her. He was excited. He asked her if Danny Maines had been shot, or if he had done the shooting. The girl said no. She told Stuart that she had danced a little and flirted a little with the vaqueros, and they had quarreled over her. Then Stuart took her outside and put her upon his horse. I saw the girl ride that horse down into the street and disappear into the darkness. While Madeline spoke, another change appeared to be working in the man Haw. He was not long disconcerted, but his discomfort wore to a sullen fury, and his sharp features fixed in an expression of craft.
"Well, that's mighty interesting, Miss Hammond. Most an interesting as a storybook. Now, since you have been such an obligating witness, I'd like to put a question in or two. What time did you arrive at El Cajon that night?"
"It was 11 o'clock, replied Madeline.
"Nobody there to meet you?"
"No."
"And the stage agent and operator, they was both gone?"
"Yes."
"Well, how soon did this feller Stuart show up?"
Haw continued with a wry smile. "Very soon after my arrival.
I think perhaps 15 minutes, possibly a little more. It's some dark and lonesome around that station, ain't it? Indeed it was. And what time was that greaser shot? Inquired Haw, with his little eyes gleaming like coals. It was probably close to 1:30. It was 2 o'clock when I looked at my watch at Florence Kingsley's house. Directly after Stuart sent Benita away, he took me to Miss Kingsley's, and, allowing for that walk and a few minutes of conversation with her, I can pretty definitely say the shooting took place at about 1:30.
Stillwell heaved his big frame a step closer to the sheriff.
What are you driving at?
He roared, his face black again.
Getting evidence,
snapped Haw. Madeline marveled at this interruption, and as Stuart irresistibly drew her glance, she saw him gray-faced as ashes, shaking, unnerved. I thank you, Miss Hammond, he said huskily, but you don't need to answer any more of Haw's questions. It's not necessary. I'll go with him now, under arrest. Benita, she'll corroborate your testimony in court, and that'll save me from this man's spite. Madeline, looking at Stuart, seeing a humility she at first took for cowardice, suddenly divined it was not fear for himself which made him dread further discussion of that night, but fear for her, fear of shame she might suffer through him. Pat Haw cocked his head to one side like a vulture about to strike with his beak, and cunningly eyed Madeline.
Considered as a testimony, what you've said is sure important and conclusive, but I'm calculating that court will want to have explained why you stayed from 11:30 till 1:30 in that there waiting room with Stuart.
His deliberate speech met with what Madeline imagined a remarkable reception from Stuart, who gave a tigerish start. From Stillwell, whose big hands tore at the neck of his shirt as if he was choking, and from Alfred, who now strode hotly forward to be stopped by the cold and silent Nels, from Monty Price, who uttered a violent "ah!" which was both a hiss and a roar. In the rush of her thought, Madeline could not interpret the meaning of these things, which seemed kind of strange at the moment, but they were portentous. Even as she was forming a reply to Haw's speech, she felt a chill sweep over her.
Stuart detained me in the waiting room, she said, clear-voiced as a bell. But we weren't alone all the time.
For a moment, the only sound following her words was the gasp from Stuart. Haw's face became transformed with a hideous amazement and joy.
Detained? He whispered, craning his lean and corded neck. How's that?
Stuart was drunk. With a sudden passionate gesture of a desperate Stuart appeared to her. Oh, Miss Hammond, don't be telling that. Then he seemed to sink down head lower upon his breast in utter shame. Stillwell's great hand swept to the bowed shoulder, and he turned to Madeline.
Miss Majesty, I reckon you'd be wise to tell all,
said the old cattleman gravely.
There ain't one of us who could misunderstand any motive or act of yours. Maybe a stroke of lightning might clear this murky air. Whatever Gene Stewart did that unlucky night, you tell it.
Madeline's dignity and self-possession had been disturbed by Stewart's importunity. She broke into swift, disconnected speech.
He came into the station. A few minutes after I got there, I asked to be shown to the hotel. He said there wasn't any that would accompany married women. He grasped my hand looking for a wedding ring, and then I saw he was intoxicated. He told me he would go for the hotel porter, but he came back with the Padre Marcos. The poor priest was terribly frightened, and so was I. Stuart
had turned into a devil, and he fired his gun at the padre's feet, and he pushed me into a bench. Again he shot right before my face. I nearly fainted. But I heard him curse the padre, and I heard the padre praying or chanting, I did not know what. Stuart tried to make me say some things in Spanish, and all at once he asked me my name, and then I told him. He jerked up my veil, and I took it off, and then he threw his gun down and pushed the padre out of the door. That was just before the vaquero was approaching with Benita. Padre Marcos must have seen them, must have heard them. After that, Stuart grew quickly sober. He was mortified and distressed and stricken with shame. He told me he had been drinking at a wedding. I remember it was Ed Lincoln's wedding. Then he explained the boys were always gambling, and he wagered he would marry the first girl who arrived in El Cajon. Just so happened that I was the first. He tried to force me to marry him. The rest, relating to the assault on the vaquero, I have already told you. Madeline ended, out of breath and panting, with her hands pressed against her heaving bosom. Revelation of that secret, liberating emotion. Those hurried, outspoken words had made her throb, tremble, and burn. Strangely then, she thought of Alfred and his wrath. But he stood motionless, as if dazed. Stillwell was trying to bolster up the crushed Stuart. Haw rolled his eyes and threw back his head.
Say, Steed, you didn't miss any of it, did you? Best I ever heard in all my born days.
Then he ceased laughing, and with a glinting gaze upon Madeline that was vicious and savage, he began to drawl.
Well, now, my lady, I reckon your story, if it tallies with Benita's and Padre Marcos, would clear Jean Stuart in the eyes of the court.
Here he grew slower, more biting and sharper and harder of face.
But you needn't expect Pat Haw or the court to swaller that part of your story about being detained unwillingly.
Madeline had not time to grasp the sense of his last words. Stuart had sprung forward white as chalk. As he leapt at Haw, Stillwell imposed his huge bulk and wrapped his arms around Stuart. There was a brief whirling of wrestling struggle, Stuart appearing to be best in the old cattleman.
Help me, boys, help me. I can't hold him. Hurry, there's going to be blood spilt.
Nick Steele and several cowboys leapt to Stillwell's assistance. Stuart, getting free, tossed one aside and then the other. They closed in on him, and for an instant a furious straining of wrestling of powerful bodies made his grasping and shock and blow. Once Stuart heaved them from him, but they plunged back upon him, and they conquered.
Jean! Why, Jean! Panted the old cattleman. Sure you're gone loco, be acting this way. Cool down! Cool down! Why, old boy, it's all right. You just set still. Give us a chance to talk to you. It's the only old Bill you know, your old pal. He's always been a daddy to you. He's only wanting to have sense. Just be cool and wait.
Let me go! Let me go! Cried Stuart, and the cry pierced Madeline's heart. Let me go, Bill, if you're my friend. I saved your life once over there in the desert. You swore you'd never forget. Boys, make him let me go. Oh, I don't care about what Haw said or done to me. It was that about her. Are you a bunch of greasers? How can you stand here, you bunch of cowards? There's a limit, I tell you. And then his voice broke and fell to a whisper. Bill, let me go. I'll kill him. You know I'll kill him.
Jane, I know you'd kill him if you had an even break, replied Stillwell smoothly. But, Jean, you haven't even been packing a gun. And that there's Pat looking nasty with his hand looking nervous like. He seen you had no gun, he'd jump at the chance to plug you now, and then holler about opposition to the law. Cool down, boy. It'll come all right.
Suddenly, Madeline was transfixed by a terrible sound. Her startled glance shifted from the anxious group round about Stuart to see that Monty Price had leapt off the porch. He crouched down with his hands below his hips, where the big gun swung. From his distorted lips issued that sound which was combined with roar and bellow and Indian-like war-whoop, and then, more than all, a terrible warning cry. He reassembled, a hunchback, about to make the leap of a demon. He was quivering and vibrating. His eyes, black and hot, were fastened with most piercing intentness upon Haw and Steed.
Get back, Bill. You get back.
With one lunge, Stillwell shoved Stuart and Nick and the other cowboys up onto the porch. Then he crowded Madeline and Alfred and Florence to the wall, tried to force them back further. His motions were rapid and stern, but failing to get them through the doors and windows, he planted his wide body between the women in danger. Madeline grasped his arm and held on, peering fearfully from behind the broad shoulder.
You, Haw, and you, Steed,
called out Monty in that same wild voice.
Don't you be moving a finger or an eyelash.
Madeline's faculties nerved to keen, thrilling defiance. She grasped the revelation between Monty's terrible cry and the strange hunched position he had assumed. Stillwell's haste and silence, too, was the beginning of a catastrophe.
Nels, get in on this,
yelled Monty, and all the time he never shifted his intent gaze so much as a hair's breadth from Haw and his deputy.
Nels, chase away them two fellers that are hanging back. Chase 'em away quick.
These men, the two deputies who had remained in the background with the pack horses, did not wait for Nels. They spurred their mounts, wheeled, and galloped away.
Now, Nels, you cut that girl loose, ordered Monty.
Nels ran forward, jerking the halter out of Steed's hand, and pulled Benita's horse in close to the porch. As he cut the rope which bound her, she fell into his arms.
Haw! Get down, went on Monty. Face front and stiff.
The sheriff swung his leg, and never moving his hands with his face now a deathly sickening white, he slid to the ground.
Line up there beside your guerrilla partner. You two, they sure make a fine damn picture. A damn fine team of coyote and old mule and greaser. Now listen.
Monty made a long pause, in which his breath was audibly plain. Madeline's eyes were riveted upon Monty. Her swift mind, as lightning, had gathered the actions and words that succeeded his domination over the men. Violence, terrible violence, the thing she had felt, the thing that she had feared, the thing she had sought to eliminate from among her cowboys, was, after many months, about to be enacted before her eyes. It had come at last. She had softened Stillwell. She had influenced Nels. She had changed Stuart. But this little black-faced, terrible Monty Price now rose, as it were, out of his wild past years, and no power on earth or in heaven could stay his hand. It was the hard life of wild men in the wild country that was about to strike this blow at her. She did not shudder. She did not wish to blot out the sight of this little man, terrible in his mood of wild justice. She suffered a flash of horror that Monty, blind, deaf to her authority, cold as steel towards her presence, understood the depths of a woman's soul. For in this moment of strife, of insult to her, of torture to the man she had uplifted and then broken, the passion of her reached down towards primitive hate. With eyes slowly hazing red, she watched Monty Price. She listened with humming ears. She waited, slowly sagging against Stillwell.
Ha! If you and your dirty partner have loved the sound of human voice, then listen and listen hard, said Monty. For I've been contrary to my old style just to have a talk with you. You all but got away on your nerve, didn't ye? 'Cause why? You roll in here like a wild steer and flash your badge and talk mean and bluff your way out of it. You heard all about Miss Hammond's cowboy outfit, stopping, drinking, and cussing and packing guns. They took on religion, decent living, and sure they'd be easy to hobble and drive to jail. Listen here. There was a good and noble and beautiful woman come out of the East somewhere, and she brought a lot of sunshine and happiness and new ideas into the tough lives of us cowboys. I reckon it's beyond you to know what she come to mean to us. Well, I'll tell you. They all went clean out of their heads. They all got soft and easy and soft-tempered. They got so that they wouldn't kill a coyote or a crippled calf in a mud hole. They took to the books and writing home to mother and sister and saving money and getting married. Once, they was only a lot of poor cowboys, and then all of a sudden, they was human beings living in a big world that had something sweet for 'em, even for me, an old wore-out hobble-leg, burned-up cowman like me. You got that? And you, Mr. Haw, you come in not satisfied with roping and beating and God knows what else, of that unfriendliness to that little Benita, you come along and face a lady we fellers honor, love, and reverence, and you... With a whistling breath and foaming at the mouth, Monty Price crouched lower, hands upon his hips. He edged inch by inch further out onto the porch, closer to Haw and Sned. Madeline saw them only in the blurred fringes of her sight. They resembled spectres. She heard the shrill whistle of a horse, and she recognized Majesty calling her from the corral. "And that's all," roared Monty, in a voice now strangling. Lower and lower he bent, a terrible figure of ferocity. "Now, you both armed officers of the law, come on and flash your guns. Throw 'em and be quick about it. Monty Price is done. There'll be daylight betwixt you two before you fan a hammer. But I'm going to give you a chance to sting me. You holler law, and my way's the old law." His breath came quicker, his voice grew hoarser, and he crouched lower. All of his body, except his rigid arms, quivered with wonderful muscular convulsion. "You dogs, you skunks and buzzards, you flash them guns or I'll flash mine." To Madeline, it seemed the three stiff-crouched men leapt into instant, unified action. She saw streaks of fire, streaks of smoke, and then a crushing volley deafened her. It ceased as quickly. Smoke veiled the scene. Slowly it drifted away to disclose three fallen men, one of whom, Monty, leaned upon his left hand, a smoking gun in his right. And then, with a terrible smile, he slid back and stretched out. End of chapter 20.